Ooh. Hello, and welcome to this month's Whisky Me live tasting. Coming to you from my office this month, rather than my normal lovely drinking room, due to technical issues. But very glad you can join us for this month's tasting. We are this month tasting two fantastic whiskies. The first one, Glenwyvis single malt. Oh, the light's really bad in here. This is why I don't do it in here normally. There you go. Ooh, if I angle it like that. Glenwyvis single malt. And then we're going to move on to Milk and Honey. The Element Series red wine cask. I can't believe how bad the light is in here. But luckily you don't need to see my face so much as you do the face of our brilliant guests. So to join us on this journey, we're going to start with Glenwyvis, and I'm going to introduce you to Matthew Farmer. Hey, Matthew.
Hiya. Also from not my usual place.
Where's your usual place then?
I would usually try and do it from the distillery, but I had to get home today, so I was like, I'll just do it in my bedroom. We've got this lovely window, and I forgot it's Scotland, so we get dark at like 7 o'clock right now. So it's pitch black outside. I'm like trying to make it work inside. But
it's dark here as well, and I'm in Cornwall. It's surprising how quickly the night's closed in, isn't it, in the autumn this year?
Yeah, perfect for whiskey tasting, at least.
Well, this is it. This is what I was going to say. I spent the whole summer months doing these tastings, kind of trying to find some great reason to drink whiskey beyond, obviously, the fact that it's delicious. Because, I don't know, it is a drink that works well when it's dark outside, isn't it? And it does get easier in the autumn and the winter. That's reasons to drink it.
Yeah, it's like I can pay £60 to turn my electricity on, or I can just buy a bottle of whiskey. The same end effect, really.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. All right. Well, look, let's talk a little bit about Glenwyvis, because this is a fascinating distillery, and I've already got the kind of inside track, partly because I wrote the literature that's we supply with the whiskies and the blog post and the shop listing, but also because we did your gin this month, or actually last month. It was August gin over at Gin Me. So we already did a live tasting for the gin, the Goodwill gin, which is a fantastic product. And I got to learn a lot more about the distillery. So do you want to just kind of fire into it and tell us a little bit about the origin of the distillery and its story?
Yeah, it's a really unique story. Sometimes I think if you want to know everything about Glenwyvis, you need to set aside like probably a good hour, and we'll go through it year by year. But the big headline is that we're a community-owned distillery, which is very unusual, very unique. We were literally founded by a crowdfunder. So back in 2015, the idea came to. There's a lot of community projects going on, like the community's buying old pubs or old buildings or community hubs, that kind of thing. The idea that the community could own a building or a business in order to profit the surrounding area. And especially in the Scottish Highlands, there's a lot of Scotch whiskey, there's a lot of distilling, there's a lot of industry up here. A lot of people rely on it for jobs, but very little of it is actually owned by Scottish people. Very little of that money actually stays in Scotland. Little of it actually comes back to the local area. So back in 2015, there was like, well, what if we took this community funding model, a community benefit society, which was up until then usually just reserved for like parishes or community hubs or small pubs or something. And what if we applied that to an actual running distillery? And something I think captured the public's imagination back then. We ended up being one of the biggest UK crowdfunders ever. We got about 3,800 members, mostly from Scotland, but really all scattered around the world, who were captured by the idea. We raised almost £1.8 million, and that is just enough to build a distillery. You'd be surprised at how expensive distilleries are sometimes. But we managed to turn a green field into a functional distillery. Started distilling in 2018 and have been kind of running since then. So the way it works is that every single investor, every single member, they hold their money in Glenwyvis. They ideally get a dividend at some point when we actually make a profit, although profit is a bit of a moving target when you're just starting a distillery. We do have the Goodwill Fund, which is sort of like a charitable arm that feeds back to the Dingwall area where we're based. And every single member has an equal vote. So it doesn't matter how much you own, there's no majority shareholder. 3,800 members, 3,800 votes. There's not one person with any controlling interest, so nobody can just swoop in, buy up 51% of the company, and suddenly call it theirs. It's truly owned by the people of Dingwall, and it comes with its challenges for sure. It comes with its rewards. It's a very unique model to run any kind of business. Never mind one where you basically just spend a lot of money filling casks and don't sell it for 10 years, which is a mad business model in the best of times. But it's starting to pay off. We've got whiskey in bottles. This year, we gave £10,000 of grants to the local community, with the idea that we were able to give a little bit back at least. And then next year, we'll have a little bit more whiskey and a little bit more to give back. And the year after that, a little bit more. And the year after that, a little bit more. And that's kind of like the stone is picking up. What is it? Picking up moss as it goes down the hill? I'm sort of muddling my analogies a bit. Yeah.
Although I think
is that a good analogy or a bad one?
I think the saying is the Rolling Stone doesn't gather any moss, but then if we can get into a Rolling Stone isn't actually a stone that rolls, is it? It's one of those things that you use to flatten off lawns. That's a Rolling Stone. Yeah.
Anyway. Really?
Yeah, I digress.
I've learned well. If anything, I've learned something tonight.
But it's a fascinating story. It's one of the reasons we were so excited to feature you, because although we feature, different styles of whiskey and old distilleries and new distilleries, it's good to kind of also feature small players, large players, but then, a community-owned distillery like this, which it's the first, right? It's certainly the first in the UK, but maybe the first crowdfunded distillery in the world. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know of any others out there. We call ourselves the first, and nobody's taken us up on it in the last 5 years. So, as far as I know, yes, we are the first. And I think at the currently only there are a few community-owned breweries that have done somewhat the same thing. But as far as distilling is concerned, yeah, we're the only one.
Yeah. Okay, and then in terms of the distillery itself, talk to us a bit about the setup. You mentioned it was just a green field, because that's unusual in itself, right? Normally distilleries, even new distilleries, are kind of based on old mills or farms or whatever. But this was nothing at all, no buildings.
Yeah, it was a farm, a cattle farm before, with a lot of space and a lot of cattle who were hungry for draff and a source of water in a borehole. So it did kind of have the things that you needed. It had a really nice source of water, hard water, which is unusual for the Highlands because it's actually coming up from the borehole. So we're very rare up here in that we're using pretty hard water. A cattle farm next door that was ready for the draff, space for shed, and also some renewable energies that have been put in place. So there was a wind turbine already on the farm that had been put together with some sort of like agricultural grants that had preceded us. Some solar panels on the cattle shed. So there's all this electricity as well that was sort of getting fed to the grid. And it was like, well, we could probably actually run a distillery off of that. Not a huge one, but there's enough there to run a pretty sustainable operation on the side. And so as a sort of like farm diversification project, the distillery kind of took shape from that.
Nice. Someone's just asked a question which I was going to ask, so let's do it now. So you mentioned hard water. Is that adjusted for the mash, or is it sort of?
So you will typically soften it. So we do have a water softener that goes through it. But a lot of the things that make hard water either good or bad for whiskey are the things that also make it unique. You'll have one distillery that says our whiskey is so amazing because of our naturally soft water, and then you can literally go 5 minutes down the road, and that whiskey will tell you they're so amazing because they use naturally hard water. It affects how the yeast does its job, but it wouldn't necessarily say it makes it better or worse. So you typically take what nature gives you and you work with it. So our whiskey is definitely characterized by it, but I wouldn't say that it makes it. We wouldn't go out and try and change it just for the sake of changing it.
Yeah, well, I think anything that gives you a sort of distinguishing feature that carries through to the flavor is probably something that you should celebrate rather than try and suppress, isn't it?
Yeah, and you can read like you've got your yeast, which is it has a certain pH tolerance and it has a certain like acidity that it likes, and it needs a certain amount of nitrogen and calcium and minerals and all that kind of stuff. very rarely outside of lab conditions are you actually going to feed that yeast exactly what it needs. And if you do, the result ends up being a little bit boring because somebody else could give that yeast exactly the same ingredients and get exactly the same result. So if your yeast isn't entirely happy at the pH that you're using, if it doesn't have entirely the right temperature, if it's set a little bit hot or a little bit cold, those stressors on the yeast, as long as they're not producing off flavors, will also give you some character as well. And 150 years ago, very few people knew exactly what the pH of their water was. And whiskey has sort of like built up a certain amount of character and provenance by just using what comes out of the ground, really, or off the top of the mountain, or out of a lake or a loch.
Yeah. So speaking of character, then, what's the aim here with this whiskey? What should we be looking for? What's intentional? What's intentionally in there, and what perhaps is surprising that it's in there? Is there, are we kind of looking at a quintessentially Highland style whiskey here, or is there something else?
Yeah, I think the initial design was sort of like trying to focus on the things that we could do that a bigger distillery couldn't. Things like long fermentations, cold fermentations, the things that the need for 24/7 production and higher yields have kind of taken out of some of the bigger distilleries. So we fell into that. These days, a lot of distilleries are doing longer fermentations and slightly fruitier characters. But it's something that we were able to do when we talk about a long fermentation. We're talking about 6 days for a ferment, which is really quite long, even in the grand scheme of things. We have very small stills, very short, squat, so they take a lot of that character out. If we were an Isla distillery, we'd be making a peat monster. But with this sort of like super fruity character, we're bringing over this almost sort of like sour red apple grape character in it. And then our job as distillers is to make sure we're cutting that properly. With these short squat stills and with this really funky character, you can overshoot it very, very quickly. You can move into that funky vegetable character or sulfuric notes very, very quickly. So we have to take a very short cut. And then because we're not making any whiskey for blends, because we're not necessarily thinking about oh, well, this customer needs it 12 years from now or 20 years from now. We know that every single drop is going into a cask of single malt Glenwyvis whiskey. So we can afford quite a crazy range of casks. We can do a lot of first fills, a lot of fresh casks, a lot of wine casks, getting a little bit more experimental, like cognac and tequila. Like, it doesn't make a huge difference to us because we know that it's all going to end up as a Glenwyvis product anyway, and we'll be able to work with it down the line. So an experimental cask run for us is actually quite exciting. It's not taking money away from some imaginary bottom line 20 years from now. So that's kind of the fun thing, is being able to do these long, funky ferments, taking a very tight cut of that to make sure we're getting the best flavors, and then putting them into almost literally every cask that you could find off the back of a lorry in Scotland.
Yeah, so this one, which is batch 0119, which I think that delineates that it was distilled. It's the first batch distilled in 2019, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good job. Thank you. When I was coming up with that, I thought it was fairly simple, but the amount of times I do actually have to explain it is giving me second thoughts.
Well, you know what's
into this process.
And you must have noticed this. You know what is a bit confusing? Is on the bottle, it says 20/19, which of course is the year that it was distilled. But the batch, there you go, the batch is 0119. Now, when you do 0219, if you do that, then you're going to have, it's going to say 2019 and then 0219. The O and the 2 are going to be reversed. And I think that might be a bit like, oh.
It made perfect sense about 6 months ago.
Yeah. So yeah, you mentioned loads of different cask types. We've got red wine. I think this is right. Red wine cask, Muscatel, Marsala, and bourbon casks, and then I think refill hogsheads as well, right?
Yeah. So this kind of stems from we are doing sort of vintage style releases in these early years, modeled after sort of like a love of old Bal Blair whiskies. This idea that a young distillery, the idea that you're just going to come out of the gates at 3 or 4 years old and have your recipe completely nailed down, and you're just going to make the same thing over and over and over again. That seems somewhat unrealistic, honestly. Like you're going to learn, you're going to change things.
Yeah.
So what we're doing is our 2018 whiskey, our 2019 whiskey, our 2020 whiskey, and you can see sort of like the evolution as we're going through. The 2018 vintage that we came out previous to this, it used a fairly classic Highland trifecta of casks. It was first fill bourbon, Oloroso sherry, and refill hogshead in various combinations. Some kind of classic casks. And what really came through of that was this rich, fruity, that red apple note I was talking about. That was kind of like this revelation where it was like, okay, this is kind of what Glenwyvis character is. For a young whiskey to have this kind of character to it, that seems like something kind of special, and we should follow that through. So when we came to put our 2019 together, we were kind of like, what if we used that base, and what if we took the Oloroso out, and how can we almost replicate that flavor or find a different flavor to add to it by using casks that are a little bit more unusual. And it was a bit of a challenge. Like you're going out and you're taking your red wine casks, and we had Madeira as well, and Marsalas, and we had one Moscatel as well. We're kind of like blending them together in these different varieties. This is the one that we finally ended up with, a blend of 5 different cask types, which is a bit of a Frankenstein whiskey when you just look at it on paper. But every single cask is adding something to the overall vatting. And it's been quite exciting putting it all together.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, you've seen some of the tasting notes come up there. People are certainly getting the apple. By the way, everyone's going nuts for dark chocolate pairing, which I can kind of see. I mean, for me, it's got a lot of sweet shop characteristics to it. Anyway, I get some of those like pink prawn sweets, or maybe it's the yellow banana foamy sweets. Certainly, the apple is there. It's just got a bit of pick and mix going on, which is why when we did the colors, we did pink for sweet, yellow for fruit, because I think that's kind of it. It's that sort of sweet candied fruit thing that's the main emphasis there for me. But
yeah, what were those candies that were kind of like, they're kind of red and white? They're like red twisty licorice things. What am I talking about? Jolly refreshers?
Oh, refresher, yeah, the refreshers. Yeah, they're like really, really sticky, chewy things. Yeah, refreshers.
Yeah, they were like rip your teeth out when you were a kid, and they had like a slightly sour quality. Yeah, it seems to.
Yeah, every single time you bite into one, you open your jaw. You're like, it's just going to pull a molar out,
Yeah, it's like, this is not safe. How did this get past any sort of like regulation?
Yeah, jaw glue. Yeah, it's good. I mean, it's young still, obviously, and you know when you were talking about the long fermentation and the short stills and that kind of, all the characteristics of the new make spirit, I think a lot of that's still present in there too. So you really, I mean, we would never send people new make because it's not whiskey, but this I think it's really interesting to try, because you're seeing like really the origin story of this whiskey, and how it's going to develop over the years.
Yeah, I think with being a community-owned distillery, like one of our big things is just being transparent. And so there's no point in trying to pretend that we're older than we are. People know exactly our entire timeline. So a 3-year-old whiskey will have a 10-year-old whiskey when it's been around for 10 years. But like a younger whiskey has characters that a 10-year-old doesn't, or a 10-year-old has characters that a 3-year-old doesn't. There is a perfect future where a very dedicated collector will have every single bottle of Glenwyvis. Here's the 3-year-old, here's the 4-year-old, here's the 8-year-old, here's the 10-year-old. And you can go down the line and see sort of like the evolution as the new make sort of like disappears a little bit and the cask influence comes in. Right now, we're laying down that groundwork. And I think for the long-term die-hard fans, when you look back on these younger Glenwyvises in the future, there will be a lot of interesting things there that hopefully will be following throughout the years.
Fantastic. Right, we need to move on to milk and honey.
Yes, sorry, I ramble.
You're going to stick around, yeah? And if you have any questions, have you tried anything from milk and honey before?
Quite a while ago. I know of them by reputation, but it's been a long time since I tried anything.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we didn't manage to get a pouch of it to you this month. But anyway, we're going to bring in Dave from Milk and Honey now to chat about the distillery. Hi, mate. How you doing? Oh, no, muted.
Hold on, I'm good. There we go. More technical difficulties.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. How are things doing?
Good. So it definitely seems like the theme of this month is that everyone needs pot plants behind them for the tasting.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad we discussed that beforehand.
So welcome. This is exciting. We have never featured a distillery from the Middle East before because there really aren't many, I don't think. Perhaps you can enlighten us on that. How many other distilleries are there besides Milk and Honey operating in the Middle East, making whiskey?
That's a great question. Yeah, I'm not too certain, to be honest. I think even within Israel, there's maybe 4 or 5 now. But a lot of the surrounding countries can be quite difficult with alcohol production and consumption. I think some areas, some things are starting to sort of get a bit more normalized now with alcohol consumption, but production, I'm not too sure. Arak rather than whiskey was always sort of the more traditional kind of drink, and I think single malt whiskeys anyway sort of haven't caught on in the same way that we're seeing the sort of explosion of world whiskies of so many different distilleries, different parts of the world, different countries, hasn't caught on so much, I think, yet in the Middle East. Maybe we'll see it in the next decade or so.
And I mean, like, there may be people who received whiskey from us this month and hadn't heard of Milk and Honey, although I think the name is pretty well known and respected in the sort of whiskey industry itself. But this distillery is 10 years old now, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the company was founded in 2013. So yeah, 10 years. We sort of had an anniversary sort of party at the distillery, I think, a couple of months ago to sort of celebrate that.
Nice.
I wasn't actually there at that point because I hadn't even joined the company yet. I've only really just started. So
you've been thrown in at the deep end here with us.
Absolutely. Yeah. happy to be thrown in though.
Yeah. So can you give us the sort of potted history of how it was founded and how it sort of evolved in the last 10 years?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, it's been sort of 10 years since the initial idea of the company, and it just sort of started as this crazy dream of just a few people that kind of met for some drinks, and I think as some of us do in when we're drinking with some friends, you come up with some crazy idea of this business that you could start together or do something, and these people had this idea to build a distillery in Tel Aviv. And I think then in the cold light of day, the next day, they realized, oh, actually, we've really got something here. We really could do it. We've got, people from the tech industry that are passionate about whiskey that, have got some money behind them, some backing. We've got people that we know in the wine industry that could provide casks. We've got people that know about distillation. And, they sort of put all the pieces together over the next sort of 2 years. So the distillery actually didn't get distilling until 2015. And as well, I think they wanted to do it right. They didn't want to rush the distillery and sort of get it going straight away to get the ball rolling. They really wanted to set everything up. A part of that was getting Dr. Jim Swan involved as well. Sort of big name now in the whiskey industry, involved in so many different distilleries, setting up new distilleries around the world. But was also really an expert in kind of hot climate maturation and hot climate whiskeys like Kavalan, like Amrut in India and Taiwan. Respectively, whichever way around it is. And it sort of knew about maturing whiskey in hot climates because that has such a big effect on these whiskeys, that the whiskeys are maturing so much faster because of the massive heat that they're under the sort of Tel Aviv sun, 300 days of sun in Tel Aviv. It gets pretty damn hot in the summer, sort of reaching 40 degrees quite a bit. I was over there not too long ago, and it was pretty damn hot a lot of the time, even into September now. So that has a massive effect on the whiskies and how quickly they're maturing. But I think what Jim Swan also really liked about this project was that there's so many different climate zones within Israel as well. It's quite a small country, but you have the beaches of Tel Aviv on the sort of Mediterranean there. But you've got mountains up in Jerusalem. You've got the Dead Sea as well, the lowest place in the world where it reaches 50 degrees centigrade, and got a very special atmosphere there. The Sea of Galilee as well. So there's all these different areas And the idea was to sort of set up warehouses in lots of these different places and compare the results, like a huge experiment. And I think that has definitely been something that has been super, super exciting about these whiskies is the experimentation, is this idea of let's take, the sort of traditional Scotch whiskey regulations and make that style of whiskey in Israel, but then also apply something really, really new to it as well, experimental, crazy types of casks and the climate as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I learned about this, warehousing in dramatically different environments, I was just sort of like, oh my God, this is so exciting. I think, the obvious question to ask, which you've kind of answered already, is like when you're setting up a distillery in Israel, how do you kind of give it its own identity? Because really you're kind of setting a precedent for Israeli whiskey and perhaps Middle Eastern whiskey, if that does continue into neighboring countries, as we discussed. That I think that by leveraging the opportunity that there is with climatic conditions, that's a great step towards doing that. And wow, what an opportunity to have an aging environment similar to the Caribbean, an aging environment similar to Kentucky, an aging environment similar to Scotland, all under the same nation, perhaps not exactly as I've described, but, dramatically different, diverse.
Yeah.
And then you've got this sort of like deck of cards of maturation profiles that you can then mix together to create different expressions. It's amazing.
Yeah, definitely. But at the same time, you don't want to be too far gone as well, because there was no history of whiskey making in Israel. There's no regulations, there's no laws, there's nothing like that. So you could release a whiskey, 6 months old, 3 months old, whatever, and you could call that whiskey. And it probably would be the right kind of color as well. It would look quite dark because of that hot climate maturation like we talked about. The whiskeys go very dark very quickly, but people wouldn't have the trust perhaps that that's going to be good quality whiskey. It wouldn't necessarily taste how people perhaps would expect. So you want to have a sort of a balance between the old and the new, the sort of the old Scotch whiskey regulations that we're trying to stick to, so people have that trust in the product, that it's going to be 3 years old, that we're not using huge casks or anything like that, that it's all sticking to the same regulations, but then sort of applying a new spin on it as well. And I think that's kind of the Israeli way, because there's even within Tel Aviv itself, within the city, you've got the very old city of Jaffa, which is like 3,000 years old, which is right next to it, and Tel Aviv, which is the very new, very modern city. So it's always sort of bringing together these two things, the tradition, the old, and the new, the sort of experimental, the really innovative as well.
Yeah, the bartender in me is likening it to like a twisted classic, right? You've got the kind of the base of a classic formula, and then you're just kind of leveling it up or modifying it, embellishing it in some way that gives it an identity of an Israeli whiskey or a milk and honey whiskey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something that's gained us a bit of notoriety in the industry, doing some really crazy, really different things that have sort of never been seen before, like the Dead Sea whiskey and the pomegranate wine casks and stuff like this. Yeah, it's really it's things that have never really been seen before in the whiskey industry.
So have you had a chance yet to taste some of the sort of variety of expressions coming out of these casks? Because it must be, the diversity must just be insane, especially like when you're talking about pomegranate wood casks and things like that. So is there stuff that's kind of unusable that's going to have to be kind of blended in at some point in the future because it's just too far gone or whatever? There's
definitely some weird casks. I think Tomer, who's the head distiller, he's an amazing guy. He let me taste when I was at the distillery the other week. We tasted like an 8-year-old. It was like the oldest cask that he has at the distillery. And I was really excited to try that. I was like, oh wow, the oldest milk and honey ever. And he was like, yeah, no, don't get excited. It's basically unusable. That's the only reason that it's still there in the warehouse. And yeah, I tasted it. It was really, really strange. Closer to like a mature gin than it was a whiskey, I'd say. Interesting to try. But yeah, I think just because of the sometimes the intensity of the environment, the whiskeys can over mature so quickly. And And it's quite interesting, actually. There's sort of a bit of a comparison to the wine industry as well in Israel, because a lot of the Israeli wines, the red wines, can be so heavy and rich and intense that a lot of the work of the wineries is actually to try and sort of restrain the wines as much as possible. It's a little bit the same with the whiskeys, because you don't want them to be, so full on and just attacking people's palates left, right, and center. You want there to be a bit of subtlety and complexity there as well. So it's about sort of balancing that and restraining the whiskey in a way as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned red wine, and this is, of course, a red wine cask whiskey. So it's part of the Elements series, right? Which I believe is whiskies. There we go. Is it 3 different whiskies you've got aged in 3 different types of cask? Is that right?
Exactly, yeah. So kind of with the main range, you've got the classic, which is like the original whiskey, where we sort of showcase the style of the whiskey that we're trying to make. It's quite sort of malty and honeyed. And then with the Element series, you've got 3 whiskies that take the classic, take sort of half of the classic, 50% of that recipe, and then apply a different element to it. So you've got the sherry cask, which won best single malt in the world this year, which is great. And then the peated version as well, which is a little bit smoky. And then this one is the red wine cask, which is taking sort of local Israeli red wines and using those. And as I said, there's that interesting link there with the red wines, that they're trying to sort of restrain them, and also not trying to use. I think originally there were a lot of Israeli vineyards and wineries that were using sort of French style grapes, and it wasn't really working too well. And now the sort of wine industry has turned around and sort of started using more Mediterranean styles of grapes like Carignan, which work a lot better for the wines, and that's mainly what we're trying to use here for this whiskey as well. But it's not as well, I think it's not casks that are sourced through some random broker where we have no idea where the wines have come from and how long the wines have been in the casks or what type of wood it is. All of this we know exactly. We're sourcing these from places that we know really, really well. We know the wines, we know the wood, we know how long it's been aged, and those are coming fresh to the distillery the same day that we buy them sometimes. So it means that we've got really, really good control over the types of casks that we're using there for this expression. And something I really admire about this whiskey as well is that when I've been talking to the people at the distillery, this is the one that they say is the hardest for them to make, because they, especially Tomer, I think, doesn't like winey whiskeys. He doesn't like whiskeys matured in red wine casks a lot, because I think sometimes he thinks they can be sort of overbearing. The wines have too much of a say in the whiskey. It's very easy to sort of muck up and you lose a lot of the distillery character. Whereas I think with this one, they tried to really, again, sort of restrain that character of the wine, bring out more of the distillery character, but also have like an interesting sort of floral notes and sweetness coming through from the wines with this one.
Does tend to divide opinion a little bit, red wine casks. I personally love them. I wouldn't want to drink them all the time, but when I find a good one, I think it's delicious. All that kind of red fruit that you get off them, and sometimes floral, like rose kind of notes. I'm a sucker for that. Like I say, I wouldn't want it to be an everyday thing, but it's good to get them every now and again, for sure.
Yeah, they can definitely be quite difficult to balance, I think. It's one of the things that talking to Tomer, I got to really respect about him is he has such like an attention to detail with the blending of the whiskeys, with the marrying of the whiskeys, that for something like the classic, which remember half of this is based on, he adds 0.5% of virgin oak normally to a batch to sort of add a little bit of body, add a bit of depth to it, and actually tried it with him side by side of without that 0.5% of virgin oak and with, and the difference was quite amazing. So you think then with this one, because it's based half on that recipe, there might be 0.25 of just a tiny drop of a cask of virgin oak in this, and that will give it a slightly deeper sort of character and a little bit of woodiness, a bit more complexity to it perhaps.
Do you know how big the batch is for these?
I don't, but I have heard there is a certain man in the audience called Shilton who may be able to answer any questions that I don't know. So perhaps he can give an answer in the comments.
Shilton is lurking around. Yeah.
He's lurking.
I've just realised he's actually answering questions.
Yeah,
so
he's there.
Let's
like
have a look.
Ninja.
Let's these questions and answers up, because he's on well, I think, isn't he?
He's the comment ninja.
Yeah. So one of the questions was, what's the Angels share in Israel? To which is that the answer? That's extraction rate wood is in high in Tel Aviv, Tri-Apex, Dead Sea for the range. So this is all about wood extraction. I think Pesha asked, is it worth losing 25%?
That would be at the Dead Sea.
Yeah. He also asked what the limit is on age in Israel. I mean, I guess there's no limit.
There's not necessarily a limit, but I think you're going to hit a limit in terms of Angels share because, as we were just sort of talking about there, 25% of the Dead Sea. You think, after 4 or 5 years, you're not going to have a huge amount of whiskey left. You're going to be left with, a couple of centimeters in the bottom of a barrel, and you're not even certain of how drinkable that's going to be. In Tel Aviv, things are a little bit more calm. Only 12% Angels share there, between sort of 10 and 12%. But still, you're thinking, over 10 years, 15 years, again, you're not going to have a lot of whiskey left. So we're thinking that the warehouse that's up in the mountains, the Jerusalem mountains, that might have a bit more of a chance at maturing some older whiskey, particularly in the certain types of casks where you get less Angels share and a little bit more subtle maturation. There's some casks made of French oak, which we get from Cognac region, that they have a little bit, the wood is more dense. The Limousin oak is more dense, so they get a bit less Angel share out of those. And they're thinking that they might be able to do, 10 years, 15 years in one of these types of casks, especially if it's up in the Jerusalem mountains.
It feels like we're not likely to see age statement whiskies from you guys anytime soon, because it just doesn't seem like it sort of misses the point, right? When you're blending together 3 or 4 year old whiskies from the Dead Sea with 5 year old whiskies from Tel Aviv and maybe 8 to 10 year old whiskies from the mountains, the age statement's going to be 4 or 5 years. Doesn't really tell the whole story, does it?
Definitely. Yeah, it's really strange. Actually, like one of the best whiskeys I tried on our trip to Tel Aviv, maybe one of the best whiskeys I've ever tried. Technically not even whiskey yet. It was only 1.5 years old. The Sea of Galilee warehouse. It was a peated whiskey from a sherry cask, and it was just absolutely gorgeous. You taste it and you think it would be, 15, 18-year-old Scotch whiskey. And you think that's 1.5 years old. It's absolutely insane. So when you're talking about age statements, it's like, it doesn't make sense, because the whiskey is it's often ready at 3 years old. It's often, perfectly ready to be bottled, because that acceleration that, as Shilton was saying, the wood extraction that you're getting and that acceleration of the maturation is just so intense.
Amazing. And that's like larger cask as well, so less wood. And yet still like massive, like sped up maturation, and I assume Angel share as well.
Yeah.
So this whiskey, case in point, right? I mean, I don't know what the age is on this whiskey, but I'm assuming it's not very old. I guess we're talking like 5 years old or something like that, and yet feels pretty complete at that age. You're kind of wanting for red wine character, cask character. There's fruit there, and distillate derived fruit, but also fruit from the cask. Spice. It's got a nice fragrant quality to it as well. I think it's really nice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there'll almost definitely be some 3-year-old whiskey in the batch, and then some of it will be 4 years old, maybe 5 years old at most. So yeah, if there was an age statement on this whiskey, it would be 3 years as the minimum. Yeah,
amazing. Layers upon layers of flavour. What else are we saying? We got lots of comments coming through. I'm just going to sort of click wildly at them and see if any of them make any sense to anyone watching after the fact. Really good. So, what would be your sort of favourite pick of the milk and honey range? What is it you're really enjoying drinking at the moment?
The sherry has been really good. That's been a favourite of mine for a long time, even before it won the big award. But I think it's because of the effort that they went through to make that whiskey. I think it's part of the sort of Israeli personality, is like, if you want an Israeli to do something, you tell them they can't do it. And it was almost that way with the sherry, because all of the milk and honey products are kosher. So it's quite easy with this one, because they're all Israeli red wines. So the wines are kosher in the first place, but it's normally wine that's the issue with with the whiskeys being kosher. Whiskey itself is normally kosher. But there's no such thing really as a kosher sherry. There's maybe one or two, but they're very, very difficult to source, and sourcing casks of kosher sherry is almost impossible. So they actually went to Jerez, found a bodega that would work with them, that would make a kosher sherry, found a rabbi from Barcelona to come there to bless the whole process and make it kosher, had the wines matured there for a year, 2 years, and then sent back to Tel Aviv, and they could start making the whiskey. So it's like quite a process, quite an effort that they went through to make that one, which I really respect and find quite amazing.
So, I mean, I'm a little bit ignorant to this. Beyond the rabbi blessing it, is there any other elements of the production that need to, be done in order to be classified as kosher?
I think if you can get it's sort of the process needs to be certified when it comes to wine anyway, especially the wines that the process needs to be sort of blessed and needs to be overseen by a rabbi if it's not being made by Jewish people, I believe anyway. People can correct me on that in the comments if they like, or Shilton can elaborate further.
Cool, brilliant. Well, look, I think it's fantastic. We're getting some great tasting notes coming through as well. Let me see if I can put some of them on. There we go. A little pep from the bourbon cask, lovely, helps with the sweetness. Yeah, I mean, I just think it's a really, really tasty whiskey. I've not tried the sherry one myself, actually. I need to get hold of a bottle of that and give it a go. Yeah, it's lovely. Cool. All right. Well, look, guys, thank you. Unless you got any questions, Matthew, for David.
I did have one, just so I can squeeze it in. What's fermentation like in Israel? Do you have to have cooled fermenters or chill jackets or anything?
Yeah, absolutely. I think all the fermenting tanks are all like double sealed and jacketed so that they're all cooled so it stays at the right temperature, because otherwise you just wouldn't be able to ferment at all, I think, and keep it at the right temperature. I think it was something they very carefully planned and thought about, because temperature tends to be the issue.
Yeah, I can imagine. Fascinating.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I can't wait to taste some Glenwyvis as well. I've been looking forward to that. I haven't tried any yet, but we'll definitely attempt to.
Well, you guys are on email chain with each other now, so I'm sure you can sort something out. All right, thanks, guys. Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Thank you for all your wonderful comments, and we will see you next month.